I'm Jonathan Zeitlin. I'm the scientific director of Access Europe, which is organizing this event, and a professor of political science at the University of Amsterdam. We can see from the full house that this momentous event, which we all knew was coming, but we didn't know the ending of the story, has attracted you here. It is a big challenge for everyone, including academics who have been following the relations between the UK and the EU for a long time. Suddenly to make sense of the outcome of this referendum, which clearly is going to have historic implications for the United Kingdom, if there is a United Kingdom, for the European Union, and I won't say if there is a European Union, and for the world, which, whatever happens, will continue at least until global warming does us all in. And we have here a very distinguished panel of commentators. We have an economist, a lawyer, and a political scientist, and that sounds like the beginning of a joke, but it's not. And so let me introduce the panel briefly. The format is going to be that each speaker will have 10 minutes for an initial set of remarks, and then we'll have another round of 10 minutes, and then we'll open up to you, the audience, for questions and answers and general discussion for half an hour. The idea is that the first round of comments will be looking backwards at the outcome and the campaign, and maybe also for some the history of the relations between the UK and Europe. And in the second round, we will look forward to what the consequences may be at these different levels for the UK, for the EU, for the world economy, and so on. So our first speaker, and I'll introduce them in the order that they're going to speak, is Sweder van Wijnbergen. He is a professor of economics at the University of Amsterdam. He has been Secretary General of the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs. He has worked at the World Bank. He's been a visiting professor at Princeton. He has a PhD in economics from MIT, and he has published very widely on a range of macroeconomic, fiscal, financial issues, covering not only the Netherlands, the EU, but internationally. I'll just mention his two most recent publications, or at least the two most recent ones that appear on your website. No doubt there are more underway. One is called Fiscal Deficits, Financial Fragility, and the Effectiveness of Government Policies in the Journal of Monetary Economics, and the other is called Learning Dynamics and Support for Economic Reforms, Why Good News Can Be Bad, from the World Bank Economic Review. Our second speaker is Gareth Davies. He is a professor of EU law at the VU University. He has had various other positions, including Fernand Braudel Fellow at the EUI. He is co-author of one of the major textbooks on EU law with Damien Chalmers and Giorgio Monti, and he is currently running a project funded by the International North Face Foundation on the impact of the European Court of Justice on national welfare policies, not completely far from one of the sub-themes of Brexit. And finally, on my right, we have the co-director of Access Europe, Ben Crum, who is professor of political theory at the VU. He has published very widely on issues of European politics and the political theory of European integration. He's the author of a book called learning from the EU Constitutional Treaty. We're now waiting for the sequel, Learning from Brexit. And of many articles, I mention only one, Saving the Euro at the Cost of Democracy, ? In the Journal of Common Market Studies a few years ago. So without further ado, I pass on to Sweder, and you have 10 minutes for your first round of comments.
All right. I guess.
Yeah, why don't you do that?
I guess this outcome sheds new light on the phrase "wisdom of crowds." It's sort of hard to believe when a country that is very much integrated in international trade and to a large extent is living off delivering financial services on an international scale, that it would voluntarily put itself outside the largest trading bloc in the world. And that's sort of an extent of irrationality. Well, we know that sometimes voting competitions give outcomes that are difficult to follow, but this one is a very difficult one to follow. Let me add some more to that. It's probably even harder to believe that a country that runs a current account deficit of 7 or 8% of GDP, they spend more than they generate in income. That's quite a large amount, 7 or 8%, and that's almost entirely funded by direct foreign investment that keeps that deficit going. And they voluntarily decide to take a set of decisions that will immediately cause a complete dry-up of that inflow of direct foreign investment. We've already seen that. I mean, that probably the largest fall since George Soros in the pound in a single day. 10% in a single day is a massive change. And that clearly signals that, A, it was a major surprise. Nobody saw this coming. Even the betting agency thought that the odds were very much against Brexit. And that certainly the polls didn't see it coming, and all the sort of smart economists who were asked, no, they can never do that. It is such an unreasonable thing to do. Even the Brits will understand that they sort of shoot themselves in their own. Well, they didn't. I don't know to what extent I think there are a whole host of issues that are coming up because of this. One of the striking features is that the election outcome was highly unusual in that typically the UK has sort of two large parties that keep each other roughly in balance, and there is a small party that does the swing. That's not the way it looks like this time. This time you see an extreme divide showing up throughout the UK. You see that the areas where Brexit won, they won big time. And the areas where they lost big time. And so there is one part of Britain that wants to go one way, there's another part that wants to go the other way. It's very simple. It's Scotland and London that want to be in the EU, and it's sort of the rest of England and Wales that want to go out. And there is, I think this clearly raises doubts on whether the United Kingdom will survive. I would suspect that Scotland will want to leave. London, to its own regret, probably won't be able to step out of England. So that's not going to work. But we see it's very clear that there is an enormous amount of turmoil. Moreover, the Brexit, I think it's more of the political scientists here, but it's very clear that what they were voting about was something else. So they weren't thinking about the benefits of the European Union, because they would immediately have said, no, of course we want to stay in. It's something else. Just the way I think immigration is probably not the main reason, although that's what people get worked up about. But all the economic analysis shows that Britain has been a major beneficiary of immigration. One of the reasons why the UK has done relatively well since the crisis is the influx of cheap labor from Eastern Europe. So it must be something else. What I think it points at is a flaw in much, well, I won't cross the boundaries and talk about other fields, but on economics, that we tend to focus on long-term benefits of policies, and because they're so large and they will last so long, we claim that therefore transitory problems are not very serious, but the problem is they are very serious and they've been underestimated. There are large groups in British society, like there are in the Netherlands, that have been left behind, partially as a consequence of reform, partially as a general shift in the global economy, where we see a very large skill premium arising. There is an increase in inequality. Some people do very well, and a large number of people don't do all that well. and they don't know. We don't know what to do about it. And I think that's, Brexit is a reflection of that. So it's not really whether the trade elasticities are high or low, or whether the deficit, whether the exporters are going to lose or gain. That's not what is at issue. It's clear that we haven't been successful in spreading the gains from measures that were in itself reasonable sufficiently widely. I think that's part of a much wider problem that is at the moment plaguing the Western economies.
Okay, thank you. You're stopping there. A very interesting and challenging set of remarks, which raises the question on the one hand, how can economists and economics explain voting behavior, and on the one hand, you would expect that the long-term benefits of policies would shape voting behavior, but then on the other hand, we see that doesn't seem to be the case, and yet there are economic dimensions clearly to the voting behavior. The question why they focus on Britain's relation to the EU rather than policies that affect economic inequality, social inequality more directly is an interesting one.
Why did people in Holland get upset about an association treaty with Ukraine?
Indeed.
I think most people who voted against it probably didn't know where the country was.
Indeed. It is a real challenge also for political scientists. But now we turn to
Thank you very much. I agree with the framing of the problem in terms of why did they make it about Europe. I'll come back to that. I think that one of the things that's really going on here is that when the ruling elites become too divorced from public opinion, then populists sense that as a weak spot and they push on it and they just keep pushing and they keep pushing, and it's very difficult. The only real way to solve that problem is either for, if you like, the ruling classes to change their position, or for the public to be persuaded to change theirs, and both are actually pretty difficult. But I mean, what struck me about this result is that in some ways it's the right result for the wrong reasons. I don't think it's the right result. I was very disappointed. I didn't want it to happen. I think it's a great shame. But I think it is a fair reflection of the sentiment of the people in Britain. And I guess, democracy is the right to do stupid things. It's not just the right to do sensible things. And so in that sense, even those who voted for Remain, I think many of them, their heart was with Brexit. But they saw pragmatic reasons. And this is interesting, though, but it's for the wrong reasons, because the campaign was marked by the most staggering dishonesty. I mean, it was just spectacular. I don't think Brexit said, if you vote for Brexit, it will always be sunny in the summer, but they came really close. I mean, they told people, public services, ever since I was a child in Britain, public services have always been a big question in the UK. It's nothing to do with Europe. It's an entirely indigenous problem. But they said, if we leave Europe, then we can save the money we contribute and pump it into the health service. I don't think there's an economist on the planet that thought that was plausible, because, of course, leaving Europe will make them poorer, probably, and they'll have less money to spend. But they just said it. And as people bought it. They said, what we're going to do? This is not a nationalistic movement. I find that interesting. It's not a protectionistic, actually Britain remains one of the most open and cosmopolitan and tolerant societies in Europe. It's just it's a sovereigntist movement, if anything. They want control. And they said, you know what, we're going to leave, and then we're going to renegotiate terms, and we're going to have free trade, because we believe in free trade, but without all the other irritating stuff. And you're kind of like, how are you going to get that? Because all the other irritating stuff is the rules of free trade. They said, we're going to dump the supremacy of EU law, which sounds nice, but I don't think there's a club on the planet where you can be a member without promising to respect the rules. And so they lied to a really dramatic extent, and they exploited immigration as well, which is actually not such a big problem in most of the UK, but they managed to push it up and make people feel it is. And what they did is they exploited what exists in the US as well, in the Trump phenomena, and also overall disaffection generally. What characterises Britain within the EU is that for a rich country, it has much too much poverty. It has too many extremes. You can go to London's fantastic town. There are some other towns, cosmopolitan, interesting, wonderful towns, and then you can travel in the train for an hour and you get out and you go, what has happened here? You know, you really feel like you've gone back or somewhere horribly poor, and there are just too many people who feel like their lives are hard or their lives are difficult, and they are kind of ignored by British policy. And if you screw over a group of your population for long enough, they will just get angry and go for revenge. And I think, you know, then this was a convenient issue, and it worked. And so, you know, in that sense, it's a wrong result. It's nothing to do with anything. They just exploited protest. And yet, the funny thing is, although these people did it, they voted for Brexit in an uninformed way and for bad reasons, I think, if you look at it objectively, it is the sentiment of the country. You know, the British have never felt European. And I don't think that should be phrased as a critique of the British, because it's not a particularly nationalistic thing. They feel a much stronger connection with the rest of the Anglo-Saxon world, and indeed with India and Pakistan. They have a different history. I mean, even Churchill said he was a great proponent of the EU, but he said, we are with Europe, but not of it. He never saw Britain being in the EU. And the Brexit, funnily enough, there's an absence of Europhobic rhetoric. They say, we want to be friends. We want to be good friends and partners with these countries. We just don't want to be in your club. That's your club. You're Europeans and we're British. And to some extent, I think, you know, you can say that's silly, that's not silly, but all these kind of identity questions, they're very emotional. And if maybe you could make an economically rational argument that it would be better for the Netherlands to join the US, but probably wouldn't want to do it. If they really don't feel comfortable, you kind of think, okay, you know, be brave, follow your hearts. And so in some ways, they took the right decision. There's also, I think, the funny thing is, it's not even a very British decision, because there is a genuine... What frightens me about this result is that in its critique of the EU, it actually is a sentiment that you could find in most European countries. It's not motivated by the rejection of all kinds of movement or by the desire to put up barriers to everything. It's a sense Europe's gone too far. You know, Europe dominates too much. Europe should be smaller. We should have more control back. And you can make sort of scientific arguments about whether that's true, not true, whether that's going to make us poorer or richer. But that sentiment, that's going to play great in the Netherlands. Geert Wilders is using it. It plays in throughout Northern Europe, actually. I think it plays in France now and in Italy even, and they were the most Europhile countries. It plays everywhere. And so although it's been expressed most forcefully in Britain, it's a general critique of Europe, which many Europeans feel. And my concern is that critique has to be responded to somehow, or we're just going to get more and more explosions. And I hope that the political class, if you like, are capable of reacting to that in an intelligent way. I'll come back to that issue in the second round. I mean, I wonder if it's also going to be good for Britain. I should say I've got a colleague in European law in Britain who says, you know, professional deformation is you become vaguely Europhile if you work in the European field. But he said it's just what Britain needs, because you know what Brexit's going to do? It's going to destroy the city and it's going to puncture the housing price bubble. And he said the whole country has basically become a puppet on the end, or the city says jump and the whole country jumps. And there's no rational policy made anymore. They just ask the city, what would you like? And they do that. He said, we can never run this country properly until we destroy that grip of the city, and it will do it. So it'll have other effects. And I thought, you know, it's an interesting off-the-wall argument, but there's something true, because there is something very, very distorted in British government in the way this massive concentration of so much, if you like, wealth and opportunities in small corners of the country and neglect of the rest. So, you know, we will see. But what it leaves is a horribly divided country. And you know, I look at it and I thought, gosh, we're seeing American politics emerging here, in the sense of a division which is not just based on disagreement, left-right disagreement, but it's kind of mutual contempt. You know, that's what characterizes, so that it's not just like, I prefer this, you prefer that, let's argue about it. It's really, you're my enemy. Like sort of the Liberal Democrat and the rural Alabamian Republican. It's like it's almost war without violence. And that kind of passion really leads to terrible politics and terrible social division. And I thought, I hope we're not seeing this emerging. The ingredients are there in Britain, because there's a kind of bitterness. The young, I mean, there's a tweet going around that's being retweeted. I don't know how these things work. Under 24, 75% voted for Remain. And they're kind of like, the baby boomers have screwed us up again. You know, they fixed things, so they started work at 30, they worked 36 hours a week, they stopped work at 60 with fat pensions, we're paying for it all, and now as a final kind of fuck you, they're taking away our future in Europe. I mean, again, you can argue, but the sentiment is really there. And, whether this can be defused to some extent depends on the deal that comes. Because I think even amongst the Remainers, there is a very strong British sort of libertarian instinct for small government. And if they can negotiate a kind of free trade deal and a successful association deal, then I think actually everyone will be happy with that. It's not that there are many British people who want to be in the EU as such. They just want the opportunities and the openness. They buy that. But I don't know if they can negotiate that deal. I mean, we will see. We live in interesting times. But at the moment, you're not hearing very many positive sounds from the other side of the water. That's a bit scary.
Scary indeed, and also full of paradoxes. I mean, just let me pull out two paradoxes to think about from what Gareth said. Britain, as a country of free traders and in some sense economic liberals, who threw open their labor market after enlargement without transition periods to the new member states of East Central Europe, and now want to think about how can we have fully free trade, but without people flowing across borders. Is that actually possible? Second paradox is that if you had to choose a country in Europe where the bite or impact of EU regulation and policy is weakest, it would have to be the UK, because the UK has the largest number of opt-outs of core EU policies. And yet, it's in the context of the UK which has been most upset about rule from Brussels. And so, just as there's this disconnect that we talked about, that the previous speaker talked about, between, if you like, the economic costs and benefits of membership and the way this was perceived by the population, there seems to be an equal disconnect about the impact of the EU as a system of policy, regulation, and governance on the UK. So that raises the question of if it's not that there is a real connection between what the EU does and how people in certain countries feel about them, what sort of things can the EU actually do in terms of reforming the way it makes policy and does business in order to assuage those sentiments in the population? And here I turn to the political side.
Yes, thanks. I'm not going to directly respond to that. There's a bit of embarrassment as an academic to speak about this. I mean, this feels almost like a collective soul-searching session, that we're still a bit dazed and confused what has happened to us and what will happen. And I don't pretend that there's a lot of sense-making or definite truths or insights here. What I think we should start in this is to make a narrative and indeed to come up with some hypotheses, and that's what I try to do. And the second thing is very much that there are some general issues here that go much beyond the UK, apply to other countries. There are also, of course, very specific UK-specific issues here. And one of the chances is really to disentangle that. So the question for now is what has happened in this round? How did we get here? And I think the key issue is that, and that's from a very political science perspective, is the uncoupling of electoral politics and the EU issue. So we have elections and we have referendums, and the referendums are on the EU. And of course, I mean, for me, in a way, this started in the late 90s with Tony Blair, who deliberately, in a way, took the EU out of the elections. They said, was the first there to promise again a referendum. I said, well, I'm not going to waste any campaign capital on the EU, but instead, you will get a referendum. So of course, here we see that politicians use European integration. And of course, there's a pressure of the divided parties, most notably now the Tories, but Labour is as divided on the issue. But there's a big temptation, and that certainly does not only apply to the UK, to bring the EU issue out of the electoral politics and indeed to separate it and say, well, we deal with that separately. Well, this promise that Blair made, he never delivered himself, of course. It was postponed and postponed. The Tories came to power. Cameron faced severe opposition on Europe and indeed the potential competition of UKIP. And in the end, he did call a separate referendum, which probably also helped him to win the last election and to keep his party together for as long as it lasted. But the referendum, of course, in the UK would always be difficult to win. And the UK, of course, is a very particular member of the European Union. And I very much share the point that Gareth has made, that that the outcome of this referendum reflects a certain sentiment of the country. I mean, the United Kingdom has never been a wholehearted member of the European Union. For many reasons, it still sees itself as an empire, maybe in retreat, but still. The press environment is much more hostile and politically powerful than probably in most other European countries. And Blair, of course, when he was the first one to promise a referendum in the last 20 years, knew that it would be an uphill struggle. And actually, then 52%, well, it's only 2%. I mean, actually, one way to look at it is, I think, actually Cameron came as close as he could. I think at most moments over the last 20 years, maybe except for kind of the post-97 kind of New Britannia, post-Blair election moment, but beyond that, this would have been a pretty good result actually in the environment that you face in Britain, or the general sentiment so in a way we came close, or they came closer. So what could something have been done to make those 2%? I mean, where did it go wrong? How close could we have been closer? Could we indeed have flipped the result there? Well, I mean, one question, of course, is what has Europe done on this? Well, Europe negotiated a deal with Cameron that I don't think we heard much about anymore once it was settled. I don't think it persuaded many Britons to vote for Remain because they got such a wonderful deal and it really answered to their anxieties. But I'm not really sure that European interventions, engagement, involvement could have made a difference. This, in that sense, was also very much a UK internal dynamics, as far as I can assess it. Obama, of course, intervened. That I'm not sure that result, that effect has probably been lost in the meantime. Indeed, actually, I think, of course, what colleagues of mine do is that they track the polls and they follow the campaign and they see shifts every day, every week, and every event. And in the end, I'm not too sure really when the campaign in the end made such a big difference overall. And if we had the referendum 2 weeks earlier, 2 weeks later, things would have been really different. I mean, the Brexit campaign, I think, my impression is it didn't bring many assets really to the campaign. I'm sympathetic enough to the average British voter to think that they could spot the lies. And they knew that there were lies being thrown around. And Farage and Johnson and Gove, I'm not sure they convinced a lot of people who weren't convinced already. What they had, of course, is, and even the migration, I mean, a lot has been talked about migration. I mean, I think that it really goes to the sovereignty issue. It goes to, my overall impression, it goes to a sense of ruling ourselves that is somehow under siege in the European Union. Or to turn it around, for all the time it seems that indeed the Remain side was constantly shouldering the burden of proof. It had indeed the rational arguments, it had the economic arguments, but in the end, in that sense, economists don't necessarily convince the voters. Well, the question is also whether for the average voter we should insist that economic or even interest-based arguments should be decisive, or whether indeed we should admit that these sovereignty sentiments are real and are British, and that they voted upon them. What you then see, of course, and which I think is probably the most dramatic thing, is indeed the internal divides in the voting results. They've been mentioned already. The age cleavage is pretty dramatic, and that would be interesting whether this result is going to come is going to haunt the British politics, and whether younger generations indeed will campaign and mobilize to revert it sooner or later. But of course, more urgent is the geographical cleavage, where not only Scotland and London, but also Northern Ireland, and I think that's also a reason for concern. Their majorities came out for the Remain, while in the rest of rural England mostly, and in the bigger part of Wales, we saw the exit prevail. So I think those are basically, that's how I look back on how we got here. And then I think we're slowly turning to where are we going?
Thanks, Ben. Here too, I won't say I see paradoxes. There is one, very striking feature which goes beyond this specific referendum that I think Gareth also mentioned, but also Sweder in a way, and that is the new kinds of cleavages that are emerging in electorates. The cleavage between young and old, which is very visible in the Democratic primaries in the United States. So you also had something like 75-80% of young people voting for Sanders over Clinton. Also the social polarization. You had 86% of manual workers supposedly voting for the Austrian Freedom Party presidential candidate. I mean, these are very big numbers relative to historic electoral cleavages, and it's interesting to think about what that means. The other thing which strikes me is about democracy. And there is a classic argument for democracy, which is the epistemic argument for democracy. And we have also heard that among the people who thought that politicizing the EU would be good if we had elections at the EU level, which were like national level elections, because it would lead, as John Stuart Mill hoped, to a clarification of issues through posing clear alternatives and educating the public, or the public educating themselves about what these different options entail. While I think it's fair to say that democracy is the right to do stupid things as well as sensible ones, it's hard to reconcile that with epistemic arguments for the virtues of democracy. And now I turn back to Sweder to well, whatever you want, but that would be,
let me put it this way.
What is the storm like?
Well, let's start with what the referendum was about. What's going to happen now that they move out of the EU? First, I think people have tended to exaggerate the direct effects. The fact that you move out of the EU doesn't mean that you now become free game for protectionist measures. What this means, even if there are no successful negotiations, that the trade will now be governed by WTO rules, and the EU has bound itself to not raise tariffs to a substantial degree. So there isn't all that much. In fact, like TTIP, most of that also a free trade treaty, actually doesn't involve direct interventions in trade, but the whole body of regulation that should, in fact, make trade liberalization effective. And that's what the debate is about. I think trade will continue. The Dutch will have an impact. I think the bigger effects in the shorter run are sort of what I referred to in the beginning. You have a country that very much relies on funding from abroad to sustain its spending habits, and it has chased that funding out. It has changed that funding away. You saw that in the exchange rate response. So the macroeconomic consequences of this are likely to be substantial. If you run a current account deficit of 8% and you rely on direct foreign investment to finance that, and that stops overnight, you need other sources of funding, and the only way to get that is high interest rates. So you attract people to put other sources of funding at your disposal, but that is likely to cause a recession. So that's what IMF probably told them. I must admit I didn't read the IMF report, but that's what they should have told them. And I think that's going to give rise to all kind of interesting questions. We've already heard that it's the poorer part of Britain that voted to get out. So it's the poor people who voted to lower their own real wage. That's sort of an unusual thing to do. What are the political consequences when that happens? And if they get a sense of having been cheated, they've been told all these fantastic lies that the sun would shine forever and there would never be rain again in Great Britain. And now what they get instead is a huge recession that will take a couple of years. What does that do for the political climate? Do people get even? Is there even more anger, more sort of being upset, anger being going to build up, and how unstable does that become? I think, in terms of economics, it's also a warning signal to the EU, because of course the discussion has been very much now on sort of Britain-specific things, but I think to a large extent, this is also a reflection on the damage that is being inflicted by the EU being too much of a technocratic process. I think almost everything the EU has done in the past few years can be defended very well on strict economic grounds, but I think there has been a tendency of the technocratic groups running the various countries, running the EU, say, well, we know we are right, so let's just try to get this thing done and don't bother too much with building up support for it. Look at the euro, which was clearly the major change that was introduced. Whether it was right or wrong if any, is probably a subsidiary issue, but it certainly wasn't put to the voters. So the voters feel cheated and sort of put all kind of blames on that. So I think we should certainly I hope the EU draws a lesson that building support among broad segments of society is important, and if you do not do that, you threaten the entire project, as we've seen in Britain, but that could also certainly happen here also, even if it's objectively complete lunacy to turn the clock back. But if you don't convince people, and I think we'll somehow have to come to terms with the wider problem, and that is that not even EU specific, but it's very clear that there are large segments in society being left behind. It's easy to say that the long-term benefits are enough to bribe people into accepting the short-term cost, but if you're sort of a manual worker, 55, and you get fired, and you know that, and you see somebody from you don't even have to be anti-foreigner, but you just see foreigners come in and you lose your job and you will lose your job and you know you'll never find your job again. That doesn't make for peaceful thoughts. And we have basically not been successful. I think by and large we've been too casual about the adjustment problems that large changes in society bring with them. It's a very difficult problem because one way of helping people that face adjustment problem is make sure that the adjustment doesn't take place. That's the inherent conflict in trade adjustment policy. If you want people to move out of a sector, but that is very costly and unpleasant, so you pay them so that they don't have to do it, but then you don't get the adjustment. It was the reason for the whole rationale. So there's a real structural problem there. All we can say is short term it's going to be a difficult life in the UK. Clearly nobody will invest for several years to come because you have no idea what you're investing in. You don't know what the UK will look like several years from now, particularly in the financial sector. There's going to be upheaval in the financial sector. You don't know who will regulate them. You don't have access to the passport system, which is the European Union system, where if you get approved in one country, you can do your business everywhere. Well, they lose access to that. They may have to subject themselves to the ECB if they're larger banks. There's all kind of stuff happening. And that's a big part of British society, and that's going to be in turmoil. So I don't see how anybody will invest the next 4 or 5 years in the UK until that has been sorted out. That means a long period of substantial economic problems.
Thanks. Just one question, and that's about the WTO option, that as the fallback option. The Secretary General of the WTO has pointed out that Britain joined the WTO as a member of the EU, that all of its relationships with the 161 other members of the WTO would have to be renegotiated. that it benefit, and any country can block that. Countries which join the WTO today have enormous difficulties. They have to make a series of concessions, sometimes to big countries, sometimes to small countries. They would also have to renegotiate the 36 trade treaties that the...
we don't even want to begin thinking about what all
right.
this means.
So, but the point is that the idea that there is a simple WTO backstop free trade option, that doesn't seem to be the case either.
No, obviously they will have to play their own individual role in the WTO, and as you say, that's not a simple thing to do. But in the meantime, various parties have committed themselves not to raise tariffs and not to do particular interventions. But they will have to go through this negotiation process, and that's going to be a nightmare. Now, I don't think they'll have to go through 100 plus individual treaties. They'll try to do a general deal. See the way China has joined the WTO. That's also not 167 individual treaties. They'll have to do something like that. But that's going to be a very opaque process, and these sort of negotiations have shown sort of an unfortunate tendency to go off the rails because people hijack them to get all kind of other things done. And look at TTIP, which is now involving almost anything but nothing except the content of the treaty. That problem may arise there also. But I agree, it's going to be massive confusion for quite a long time, which strengthens my argument that nobody on earth is going to invest in Britain for quite some time, because you don't know what the world will look like 5 years from now. Investment is a largely irreversible commitment. You build a plant, that plant you can't take out again. That sits there for 20 years. So you want to have some idea what those 20 years will look like. Now, you're not going to see that. So volatility you should look at as a very high tax on investment, and that has major economic costs. Maybe we should also remind ourselves that the UK, before it joined the EU, was sort of a sick country, was not doing very well. They're basically voluntarily putting themselves back in that situation. It was a country where nobody was investing, there was major strife, there was sort of a lack of agreement on future policy, there was vested interest blocking every change you can think of. We very much run the risk of getting back in a situation like that.
Thanks, Gareth. Yeah.
Thanks very much. I'd actually just like to pick up very briefly on a point that Sweder just made. And this is about negotiations. But I read an article recently, as academics do, talking about negotiations. And they said one of the very practical factors that's sometimes ignored is that for 40 years now, negotiations with the world on trade and mostly on trade and economic matters have been done on behalf of the UK by the European Commission, because that's who negotiates on behalf of the EU. And they said this takes a lot of expertise, and it's not in the UK anymore. They don't have enough negotiators. And you might think that's such a banal thing. It's hard to imagine there's a shortage of lawyers in the world, but they said but they say well, exactly. But there's just the scale of the negotiations required to reach agreements with all the countries in the world. They just don't have that skill indigenously. So maybe there's going to be a wonderful market and trade lawyers are going to be... But, these kind of practical things. In the WTO, there's a very political matter. The developing countries often feel that they get a bad deal purely because they're outgunned by the big, rich countries who come with tables full of lawyers and negotiators and endless resources and data. These kind of things can make a difference, and the UK is probably not very well placed there. But that's a sort of a side issue, although actually, these issues can be incredibly important. Also I want to pick up on something else that Sweder said, which is, there is a terrible, terrible irony here, which is even if in the medium and long term Britain sort of finds a way and sorts it out, for the next few years it looks like it's going to be a mess, and the victims will be the Brexit voters, because that's, it was such a divided vote, and they are the poorer class, and they are going to suffer, and that's going to be interesting. This is one of two paths that can come out of this. Maybe they'll become even more bitter, and they'll really become confirmed that the establishment is so stacked against them, even this lot are no good. And I know, what's the next step? Civil war or something? But they'll just, maybe that's one possible path. Or the other possible path is that you will get a sort of, the new government, whoever that will be, will try and pay them off. If they're not in the EU, then they're allowed to print money if they want to. And they'll just go round engaging in policies which in the short term perhaps do, if you like, help the weaker classes, but in the medium or longer term may well lead Britain back to the 1970s and to a degree of stagnation and poverty.
It's the Venezuela model.
Yeah, and you can say many things about Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson, but I don't think anyone's ever said that their main interest was economics. So I don't know. We will see we will see what's going to happen there. But you know, actually, in some ways, I think the bigger problem is for Europe. I mean, because what happens now is that there's a period of negotiation, and there is this big discussion about whether the formal process where you give notice to the EU you want to leave, and then a 2-year period of negotiation runs. At the end of the 2 years, you've either agreed or you're just out. And the Brexit camp say, don't give your notice. First negotiate, then you don't have the time pressure. So they say we may be in until 2020 because we're going to negotiate as long as it takes to get a good deal, and then we will deliver our notice and leave. That makes a sort of sense. So there's a kind of irony that the Brexit camp are saying we're not going to leave. But I mean, you know, it makes sense. But the reaction so far from the EU is forget it. We're not talking to you. You've made your decision. You deliver your notice tomorrow. This is a hardball game, and I'm curious to see what happens here. In a way, I really do hope that Cameron doesn't do it. I actually think the longer this goes on, probably the better. Although it's uncertainty, it gives more chance to reach intelligent compromises, which are perhaps there. You know, and in 4 years, the world may look very different. Who knows? I mean, I don't think it's entirely impossible. There'll be another referendum and they'll decide to stay in. Because one possible reaction, which I've heard from German politicians, is actually, look, the EU is due for reform. We should be reforming it into the kind of club that people want to be in. So let's do that, and then maybe the British will decide to stay after all. I actually think that's unlikely. I think that requires so much political deftness. I just don't think our leaders have, it sounds a bit arrogant, I don't think they have the competence to do that. I think it's going to, but it would in some ways be a good result, I think. But at any rate, there begins this period of negotiation, and there's a big division on the continent as to how to approach that. You know, and one view, which I've heard a lot of German industrialists, and I think Dutch industrialists would share, which is, let's be pragmatic. Let's try and save this relationship. You know, if they want a kind of like free trade, but without people and without other policies, you know, okay, we'll do that. And we'll keep doing business with them, and it'll be a little bit harder for workers to move. But, you know, we can live with that. It's just, that's a pragmatic relationship. I mean, why not? The other line is like out, which is Juncker, and the institutions are very strong on. Many French politicians have said it's like out is out, in is in. Forget it, you're gone. You know, talk to the WTO. Or maybe you could have a Norway option, but a Norway option is basically just being in without voting rights.
The most extremely unreasonable.
And I'm not even sure that's not. I mean, in some ways, I think actually that might suit Britain. I mean, I speak as a Brit who works in a Dutch university. I often think, you know, my real frustration here is not that decisions are taken, but it's having to be involved in taking them. You know, there is a genuine cultural conflict. And the interesting thing is the EU doesn't, on the whole, make bad rules, and the Britain is not particularly doesn't object to those rules more than other countries. Many of the rules it embraces wholeheartedly. I think it's the process of participation which makes them feel like outsiders. And in some ways, I think, you know, I'd rather be something like a Norway option. You know, let someone else make the bloody rules and then just obey them and live with them. It's not such a big deal in the end. But I don't know if that's going to be politically acceptable to either side. But you see, the horrible factor is a pragmatic solution would seem, you know, why cut off a sixth of your economy? Why create recessions everywhere? Isn't it better to just reach a compromise? But the terrible fear of many, if you like, Europhiles and institutions is you do this, you open, the Netherlands is next. Then, you know, next year we have Premier Wilders saying, and now we'd like a deal. But he's already said this, you know, and this is what we'd like. We'd like this policy, and Denmark, and France even, and then quite possibly Germany as well. And so the whole thing falls apart. Once you start saying we can be flexible, the whole thing falls apart. I mean, of course, and you kind of think, well, maybe then it should fall apart, and maybe it should become flexible. Would that be so terrible if there was a very complicated set of relationships between member states reflecting their different preferences and interests? I mean, that's an issue, because what this really brings up for a long time, there's been this troika of big countries, which, you know, sort of France, Germany, Britain, which sort of uneasy stability, which prevented deep political integration, but, you know, deals on trade were possible. And Europe kind of rumbled along. And now it's sort of destabilized, and they have to decide how to go further. And there is, you know, one view is, which you're hearing a lot, Joris Luijendijk, for example, in the Volkskrant I saw, I'm not sure he knows much about it, from the European Parliament, which is, now at last the British are gone, we can get on with being European and we can integrate properly. We're free to do it properly. Let's integrate. Not necessarily a hostile way. We can still be friends with them. Hollande said that this morning. We'll have a friendly relationship, but we can at last integrate as Europeans. But on the other hand, there's another view which says, but we don't want that. Half the countries of Europe think Europe's gone too far, or at least it's gone far enough. We actually kind of agree with the British. Let's wheel it back a bit. And now the continent really has to sort this out, actually. They've got to take a standpoint on this. because that really determines how they deal with Brexit and how they go further. And my perception on this, and I'm not an empiricist, but my perception on this is it's a very, very dangerous topic, because I actually think that public opinion, the support for political integration is dead. If you were to put forward as a proposition, I would like the EU to be reformed so that it made trade and movement between states easy, but otherwise it left countries to rule themselves. I think you could win that in any country in the EU just like that. Of course, you might say it's impossible. It's an incoherent proposition because you can't do that. That's another question. But it reflects the sentiment of Europeans. And yet, I probably still couldn't say that amongst a gathering of European lawyers, or they'd like edgy way, or it depends. Maybe in some countries I could. There's a very strong elite, certainly within the institutions, which is committed to political integration. I don't think it's a moral issue. There's nothing wrong with political integration if people want it. It's up to them. But this discrepancy between, if you like, members of the European Parliament and certain French and German politicians and the views of the population at large is really, really dangerous, because it's just going to feed into the Le Pens and the Wilders, because they can quite legitimately say these people are not fighting for the Europe that you want. They're fighting for a Europe that you don't want. So choose us. And in a way, they're right. I mean, they're not right about very many things, but on that particular issue, they're right. And so, I would, I'd like to see Europe reformed to a somewhat more stripped down organisation, because my perception is it has reached the point where it's sometimes just making rules because it can. And because it's good at it. They're good rules, but that's not enough reason. The Swedish Parliament might be better at making rules than say, the Dutch one, but that's not a good enough reason for them to legislate for the Netherlands. But it's like all centres, like all expert organisations, it just becomes self-fulfilling, and it's good at something, and it's got the momentum, and it says, now here's a problem, social problem, environmental problem, let's get on with that. And the dynamic of decentralisation.
That's a move that is going on. I think that's what Mr. Timmermans says.
Yeah.
There is, and he isn't saying because he thinks that, we may think so, but he's saying it because he thinks that's the sense of the population, that we should only do what needs to be done on a European level, and if it doesn't need to be done on a European level, please leave it to. Now, what I think is, where the big, enormous amount of misunderstanding is where exactly does that dividing line go? I think it's very naive to think that you can have free trade. That just means you promise not to raise tariffs and have quantitative restrictions, and then you have free trade. Because lobby groups are extremely good in abusing all kind of technical specification and other regulatory stuff to actually mask what is essentially a protectionist policy, which is exactly why the EU does all this stuff. The EU, of course, has begun with an idea of a common area where people could move around. Now, I think stopping migration is of course, goes at the core of the Treaty of Rome, but it wouldn't undermine free trade. But what would undermine free trade, if you say, look, free trade measures is just specific direct interventions in trade flows and nothing else, because then you open the door to a very wide-ranging set of crypto protectionist measures that will be dressed up as environmental measures, labor measures, God knows what sort of measures. That's exactly why we have this extensive EU regulation. And you want to actually make this free trade effective by not having people use other tools to reach the protectionist what they really want is protectionism, and they disguise it. That's what the EU does, and that's why the EU does more than many people think it should do, but that's actually a mistake, I think.
There is the other side of regulation, which is that if you're going to allow products and services to cross borders, people have to be convinced that they're safe. If you have toxic food, toxic products, toxic financial products, then people will not, even if the flows come, people won't accept them. And having
this is a TTIP discussion. To what extent do we sacrifice our own ability to have environmental policy by making this deal with the US? I think that's a legitimate concern.
I mean, that's a different question. If one looks at the Commission text, that it would be hard to say that that's what it's about. So the European regulations are precisely also to ensure the confidence of consumers about these flows of products. It's just the other side of what you were saying about protectionism. So then that raises the question of, what's the halfway house? Where is the room for compromise? Can you have a Norwegian model in which you basically, outside of a few areas, accept all the regulation coming from the EU, but you don't participate in it? Can you have a Swiss model where you have a series of bilateral treaties on different kinds of issues, which are increasingly difficult to negotiate? Can you have a Turkish model, which is the customs union, which only covers goods and not services, including financial services? Can you have a free trade agreement like with Canada, which has taken years to negotiate? It's hard to see, what is the model that could reconcile what the Britons seem to want and what would be possible to have a well integrated trading relationship with the EU. But I'm Brexit for the EU as well as the UK.
Yeah. Of course, this is all speculation. But I like to think of it very much in terms of a game of chess, that it's step by step, and it's really we have to see every step. And timing will be very important. So we're talking about 2 years, 2020. A lot can happen in the meantime, but we know some points on the calendar. But start with the immediate political game. Basically, you have two parties that can now move, and the first moves have been made. I mean, Cameron has announced he will step down. He has also announced that actually he prefers, or he likes his successor to really call what is now to be done and to interpret the result. And he is not calling immediately right now the formal withdrawal procedure from the European Union. And I think. I mean, his successor, I think, or may be in waiting for quite some time. I mean, you need a Tory conference for that. So he will be under considerable pressure, I think, to call the shots sooner or later. And on the other hand, the first move has been made by the different presidents of the European Union, Tusk, Juncker, Rutte, as the chair of the Council. And they've really insisted that, indeed, they would like this procedure to be initiated as soon as possible. And we know that there's a European Council on Tuesday, where I imagine the European institutions and most other member states would like the UK to start Article 50 formal withdrawal proceedings and start the clock running, as it says, for 2 years. And Cameron probably will resist, but my estimation will be that it will be very hard for him to resist too long, and actually that there is an interest in creating clarity at some point. I mean, he needs a bit of time right now. No one knows what to do today, but I think all parties in the end have an interest in getting on the right track, if only indeed to get investments at some point, investors knowing what they're up to at some point. I think it's also that Gareth talks about intelligent responses or solutions, and people have been playing with, well, there may be a second referendum. Actually, the funny thing is that once you get a real vote and a real outcome, some scenarios seem less likely, as indeed I think a second referendum or any reversal of this vote. I think really the UK is bound to go down this road and to exit properly in one way or another. But also, for instance, I mean, during the campaign, the EEA, the European Economic Area solution, the Norway solution, was ruled out by most of the Brexiters. And actually, I think, having had the vote, it may be the easiest way to deal with a lot of difficult issues, while there still remain many others to deal with. But the more likely scenario is probably indeed that we will have a kind of one-off exclusive arrangement for the UK with new properties. And so this will be a game. What are the terms of negotiations? On what terms can the UK leave? But also indeed the separate question of what is then the new form of association of the UK with the European Union. But they coincide with two separate streams of events. One is, of course, the internal UK politics. So a lot of what's going to happen in the UK-EU negotiations will be affected by whatever happens within the UK. And so we've had Sturgeon already indicating that he's quite keen to press for a second referendum. I even think I heard us saying that actually Scotland could take the UK seat in the European Union, and that will be interesting. Then you can simply, kind of like Denmark did with Greenland, say, well, we take the seat, and the rest of the England Wales can leave again. So you do it the other way around. That's hypothetical. I don't think that can work out. But still, it just shows that internal dynamics in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, may have a real effect on the cards that the new UK government can play in its relations with the European Union, and indeed can create unexpected windows. The other side of the game, of course, is really the dynamics in Europe in general. And of course, the European Union has been badly damaged. I think that's important to note. And some policy domains more than others, of course. In some policy domains, the UK was not much of a partner and was not very much involved. But for instance, something like a European foreign policy without the UK, if ever it was to develop, is very likely to get stalled. And then the question is, so what is the political response at the European level? We have a very formalistic letter of the presidents I just referred to. But the question is very much, of course, for instance, and there's a kind of first initial reaction by Merkel. Some people are saying, well, so this is the moment that France and Germany, the French-German tandem should get its act together, to give a clear signal, indeed, to maybe even to seize the moment to move full force ahead, which doesn't sound like a great idea if you listen to Gareth. And probably they won't do that. But of course, it all depends very much on contagion, on what will happen and how will this spill over to other countries. To start with, the Spanish elections this weekend. And actually, then when you look at it, I think the card of contagion, it's a nice idea, but it's easily overplayed. So if the most Eurosceptic country in the European Union votes to leave by 52%, I don't think that many other countries really have a serious perspective. There wasn't a better feeding ground to vote out than in the UK. And actually, I think that if you look at what's happening in the UK, and also if you look at what's happening economy-wise, I understood that since the pound plunged, the British economy is now smaller than that of France in one day. I think that sets a precedent that I'm not sure. It may enthuse Wilders, it may enthuse Le Pen, but I think most voters will say, well, is that really the road we want to take? I actually think that if there's any exemplary role of this, it won't be very encouraging for anyone who wants to follow suit there. Not for the Netherlands, and of course a lot then does not depend on one or the other calling a referendum. That's not going to happen overnight. The bigger story is really elections. Who's going to win which elections? And we have 3 big elections coming up next year in Germany, presidential elections in France, and even in this country. And that's, I think, very much also the waiting game. I think everyone will be watching what will be happening there. And indeed, looking at what's going to happen with Britain, what risks and what moves, what dynamics will we see among the voters. Once that dust is settled, and I could well imagine actually that veering back to the mainstream, that actually people are saying, well, we don't want to join our own Farage. Actually, that's not a very wise course if you look at what's going on in Britain. Then actually, we may actually see the reverse. And that indeed, I think, so if anything, any collective response that goes beyond the handling of the British file is going to take place at the European level, I would expect it to only take place and to be set in motion after the French and German elections of next year. And then actually, there may be a scope for some kind of comprehensive treaty revision, and particularly of thinking of a two-tier union. This is, and that actually may also bring the UK somehow on board. Once you say, well, okay, we realize that there's a lot of dynamics of people not being comfortable in full EU membership, that there's a lot of reservations. Maybe we have to find a more permanent solutions for first tier and second tier. And of course, there's at the same time some economic pressures, some pressures within the Eurozone, some political pressures within the Eurozone that suggest to move forward with a core. You could see, if ever that's going to be put on the agenda, it will be after the 2017 elections. And that will only be the condition where indeed Britain may have a second vote. because then there's a new treaty where it may pigeonhole itself in either wing, first wing, second wing, or indeed out altogether.
Ask a question of my colleagues.
Yeah, and then we open up to the floor.
Well, sort of two short comments in the question. One is, Gareth was saying, look, this is really, or I think one of you was saying this is all about loss of sovereignty. That would make the Norway option really ironic, because that would mean you sacrifice even more sovereignty. Yeah, that's sort of, I think Cameron said that walking away from the table is not the way of getting more sovereignty. And the contagion issue, Britain really is unique. In no way Spain would go out. All that debt is denominated in euro. If their currency would crash, they would double that output ratio. They're not waiting for that. But the question to the particularly the political scientist people is, if I read what people like Boris Johnson say about immigration, and I hear Nigel Farage, who is sort of, in the words of Simon Sharma, is malignantly operating on that score. What is the chances that, I mean, are these guys not only unified by their abhorrence of the EU, but now that they have to take decisions themselves, will they start fighting each other?
We want to get the audience.
With referendums is, of course, that you find very ironic or unholy alliances mobilizing against the status quo. And we've seen that the UKIP has been a fighting ground, and for us has been losing a lot of members over time. So I don't see them operating as a united front. And actually, I think that I think the main focus of attention really should be what's going to happen in the Tory party right now. And even there, I feel that Johnson is not even sure whether he wants to jump to the occasion or whether somebody else may be there, and whether indeed there is anyone who can get enough support within this party, because I think the party is really fragmenting rather than uniting, if anything.
You have some chaos coming our way.
Sure.
Certainly politically, and the Labour Party is just as divided. Okay, you've been very patient. What I think we should do is take maybe 2 or 3 questions, and then let the panel answer them. So also, if you have a question for a particular speaker, please indicate it. The gentleman in the back.
Thank you. I'm Swiss, and so you know that we have never really wanted to join, and the situation right now indicates that we're probably very right not to do. I have a question. It was pointed out that the difference is only about 2%. So in fact, it's 4%. Sure. But as a scientist, I think that the difference is almost negligible and not significant. And with hindsight, or with Monday morning quarterbacking, why wasn't it like a range imposed on a referendum? You can do 3/5 required to change such an important thing. Why was it not done? But it's too late. And second, I heard also that it was possible for the Parliament to overrule this referendum. And given the fact that the situation is really very, very critical, do you think it's possible that it happens?
The question is, it's possible for the Parliament to overrule the referendum. It's not a binding referendum. Are they likely to do that? There's a Dutch answer to that question, I would think. So I saw Leonard Besselink, and then I'll take you over there. So 1, 2, and then we'll have a round from the panel.
Yes, thank you very much for very enlightening responses to the result of the referendum. Many points were raised, so I have to limit myself. And one of them is concerning the internal divides. I noticed that Scotland voted solidly for Remain, but only in 2 places they reached the 2/3 majority. That was the Orkney Islands and Edinburgh, as far as I could see. Which, according to me, raises also the question, how was the divide over the various parties in Scotland? Because my sense is that it was a good topic for a referendum because it cuts through party alliances. But again, you know, it also raises a question about the tenability of Scotland being in the EU or separating out of it. Why? I think technically as a lawyer, I teach constitutional law here, we have examples of a country where the EU treaty does not apply except for one specific region, and that specific region indeed takes the role in the Council. That is the case for the Netherlands, France, England with regard to their overseas territories, former colonies. And the Netherlands has the St. Martin option, which is the one which the Scottish leader referred to, which is half French and EU territory and half Kingdom of the Netherlands, but where it does not apply. Plus, there are open borders. There's free movement of persons across the island. Now, that last point is, of course, the difficulty with the Brexit, that Scotland needs to establish boundaries because it will not be acceptable to England to have free movement of persons, which is also the explanation why the EEA option, the Norway option, which culturally would be totally fitting, would not work because it goes with free movement of persons. And even the Swiss have a problem with the free movement of persons. I leave it to this. And oh yes, no, one thing. The vote was against the economy. The vote was against the city. It was against the economic establishment, the banks and such things. And that is what we will see in Spain as well.
Okay, last question in this round from the gentleman there.
Yeah, further to what he was saying about Parliament potentially overruling, I was just wondering what you think. Imagine the scenario where the economy is in crisis, it's clear Scotland is going to leave, it becomes clear that Northern Ireland is going to leave, and it becomes clear that the negotiators cannot deliver on free trade plus closed borders. When it becomes, I mean, really clear that they can only break the promises of the Leave campaign and all those, everything comes together, is there not some way to back out politically?
Do we get it back?
Can we think of such a coming together of events that they can still revert? I find that very difficult at this point, but that may be just the mood of the day. A combination of secession and new elections may actually make a difference. It would be interesting. I mean, but actually, I mean, with the kind of old party so divided, and looking at the result of UKIP at the last European Parliament elections, I'm not sure what the outcome of next election would be, and I don't think it would increase the chances to kind of reverse. So I actually think that somehow England for sure has to go all the way. I don't see much space there at this point, but that may be the mood of the day. I hope if I have a better solution in a month, then yeah. Qualified majority, that's very interesting, of course. Why not? This is such a so in a parliament you would probably indeed have a kind of double majority, qualified majority, a more intricate solution. But I don't think that works in referendums really. Actually, I mean, if you had a kind of threshold, which was a big issue in the Dutch referendum, of turnout, then of course they easily made it with, what is it, 70%. The thing is, if you have a referendum with a qualified majority, then indeed you will have a very disgruntled, potentially a very disgruntled majority who said, well, hey guys, we were a majority, and still we were overruled, and it feels like domination or oppression. So in that sense, I really think that in that it's very difficult to justify anything else but a simple majority for most cases. But I imagine that the Swiss have more creative solutions there than more other countries. Is it insignificant? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, of course, this was not a. Actually, we didn't have a sample here. Of course, this was a real turnout, and this was the population that was allowed to vote, and something may have gone wrong, but in the end, any percentage in the end decides. It's a vote against the economy, Leonard Besselink, and still the conditions are different in Spain, and I think the fear or the self-confidence of the country is smaller than somehow it was at this funny island. But so we see on Sunday. I'll be very curious. I think it's. I see the underlying momentum, but I also think that there's much more awareness of vulnerabilities in Spain than there has ever been in the UK.
Does anybody else want to come in?
Yeah,
Gareth?
just like to, I mean, firstly, the voting issue. I mean, one response to this, is that the whole idea of entrenched laws which need 2/3 majority, this is much too European. You just don't do this in the UK. It doesn't have a constitution. It doesn't have any form of entrenched laws. Everything is majoritarian. They always used to say Parliament is an elected dictatorship. With 51% of the votes, you can, in theory, do anything. And it's often discussed by British constitutional lawyers and often debated, but it's very deep in the British system. So apart from the fact that referendums are usually majoritarian, it was, if someone suggested this, it'd be like, you've gone German. No, it's alien. It's alien to the system. But I wanted to respond to a couple of Leonard's points. I mean, I think the St. Martin idea is brilliant, and I sometimes think that the weird thing is these problems are soluble. You get a few people around a table, it's possible to come up with constructions which could, if you like, which could satisfy Europe. Yeah. And also, I think one shouldn't underestimate political capacity. It really strikes me that European politicians do not seem to be terribly good at reaching intelligent deals with each other. And I think there's an awful lot of established positions and entrenched positions and lobbies and stuff which just make it really hard for them to rethink their views and to, if you like, be open to stuff. I think this is too creative. I've never seen in the European political class, including the British, any level of creativity or initiative or imagination like this. I don't think they could do it. Maybe it's to do with the number of parties involved. And finally, on the economy thing, I mean, I think this is a vote which comes from economic dissatisfaction to some extent. I don't think it's so ideological. I don't think it's an anti-globalization vote. That's a youth vote, anti-globalization. This is just personal dissatisfaction. My town is poor, my life is hard. But the weird thing is, the Brexiteers they're old-fashioned, if you like, Whigs. They are old-fashioned free-trading globalizers. All of their rhetoric is we want more free trade, we just don't want all the rules which are supposed to soften the effect of free trade. We want global free trade, we embrace globalization. And there is probably a sort of paradox there, that they've chosen radical free traders, but they've done it to some extent out of economic disaffection.
So the Republican Party before Donald Trump. Now, I saw several hands there. I'll take 1, 2, 3, the first three on the right.
Hi, Gareth Davies, thank you very much for your interventions. I was wondering the time frame now. I mean, several panelists were talking about, well, let's wait and see, let's not invoke Article 50 immediately, let's give it some time, let's create negotiation space, but at the same time we have all these economic pressures that might, in their own dynamic, spiral out of some sort of control. So, plus we have, of course, a certain level of justifiable anger, I would say, on the part of some of the people that are now left to see this chaos. So, how wise do you think it's to wait till after all these elections? Do you really think that nicely and rationally this will play out, create open spaces for creative solutions? I'm actually worried that it might create much more mess, the uncertainty as such.
Okay, the next lady in line.
Thank you so much for all your insights today. I would like to use Mr. van Wijnbergen's title, Why Good News Can Be Bad, because do you think in this case bad news can actually be good? Because we need chaos in Europe because there's obviously a lot of anti-European sentiments in Europe. So can this, because how would we have been sitting here today if they decided to remain within the European Union? We wouldn't have this debate that we're having now. So would you agree that it's actually a good thing that they voted no, because now we have the debate and we will be talking about it as Europe?
Okay, and then, yes, the lady in the striped shirt.
All right, I have a question for Gareth, more of a curiosity, I think, but in terms of the EU law, upon a complete exit of the UK, in which way EU law would become national law, or what is exactly the process? It seems very, very difficult for a non-lawyer person like myself to imagine what exactly is going to happen. So What do lawyers think about that? Simply put. And then a question for Ben, slightly in the continuation of your idea, namely the idea of politicization of the EU being good or bad, right? This is, you were saying that a little bit at the beginning about the electoral politics excluding the EU in several cases. And the politicization of the EU being a trend that maybe brings the EU back into the national. So along the same lines, the fact that EU is so politicized but is not necessarily part of the electoral politics except for the UKIP, in which way will that be, in which way the national British politics will be affected by the EU factor beyond the Brexit vote, so to say?
So the questions for all the panelists. Maybe I start with Sweder and then Gareth and then Ben.
First, I think we will know fairly quickly which way it will go, because the option of waiting and negotiating things and then starting the Article 50 procedure is very unlikely to take place. For one thing, it creates a very awkward situation within the European Union, because the UK will sit at every table, will have substantial voting power, particularly under the Since-Nice Treaty, but they will be voting and discussing things that they will not accept because they're going to leave. Now, that's already building up tension. You already hear European politicians say, look, as long as you are in, but you've announced that you are out, you're not going to have any say at all about stuff that will only concern us and not you, except that there's no framework to actually resolve that. So I think my suspicion is that the EU will refuse to negotiate anything until they start the Article 50 procedure. And as long as they don't do that, say, well, you're part of the EU and you just behave the way you did, as if that hadn't been a referendum. Now, the intriguing question, can bad news be good? Yeah, if it's bad enough, then the people who trigger it will be thrown out and something good will come of it. Now, I think the good thing I think for the UK is very unlikely to be anything that's good in the foreseeable future, given the confusion that's likely to arise and the internal fighting on the Brexit camp. It's very likely to come. I just read a lengthy, well, not all that lengthy, but the Financial Times whole interview with Boris Johnson, where he was actually very pro-migration. Boy, he has some enemies in his own camp. What would, in my view, be the good outcome if the EU would be more aware of the need to build support among the population? I think to a very large extent the European project has been hijacked by the technocrats. Even where I agree, because I agree with Gareth, I have a very close involvement with a lot of European law, European rules, because I've been involved in the reforms in Eastern Europe, and the reason why Poland, until recently, they chose the Venezuela route also now. But until they did that, Poland has been extremely successful, and that's because there was a very clear guiding principle. Whatever the government was, whether you had right-wing peasant parties of Mr. Lepper, whether you had Lech Walesa, also the Poles pronounce his name very differently, whatever there was, they knew what to do because they just implemented the acquis communautaire. They just went one rule by rule by rule, and by and large, the rules that I was particularly financial regulation, actually very good rules. You're right. The European is remarkably good at sort of having reasonable and not excessively intrusive rules. But they're remarkably bad. They're so convinced that they do this well that they think there is no need to convince the voters. Let's just sort of quickly, do it through the back door. This is obviously good. It will start working very well, and then everybody will agree. Well, that's not the way it works. Well, you are actually a former politician. You will know that even better than I do. And I hope if that's the lesson they learn, but until now, at least the Dutch politicians have done the exact opposite. They've tried to undermine the EU as much as possible. They've always been saying, look, everything that's bad comes from the EU and everything that's good comes from my party, Gerald Davies, people like that. And that, I think, is a very damaging attitude. If that would change, and if people would... and Dijsselbloem has already made remarks in that direction. Saying, look, we have to stop further political integration until we have convinced people that's a good idea. Now, if that would come out of it, I think you're paraphrasing of my article, that might in fact come true. I think that would be good news.
Yeah.
I think, although I totally agree that it's unlikely that the negotiations will get delayed that long because the mood is against it, I don't think 2 years is that long, because quite a lot of changing of position is required. Yeah, I mean, a good solution requires really some adjustment of positions, which requires domestic renegotiations in lots of countries and sort of internal discussions. And so I think 2 years plays into the hand of a sort of a hard break, which I don't think would be a good solution. So in that sense, I would rather see negotiations start tomorrow, but maybe without the formal notice. Let the negotiations take as long as they like. I'm not sure that's very likely. We will see. But what would happen to EU law? I mean, this is interesting, and it depends. Britain can do it how it likes. You know, they could say, because most EU law is implemented into national law, so they could say all law that is a result of the implementation of directives is hereby repealed. And then, bam, and then half the British law is gone. But that's almost unthinkable, because, you know, then they've got no law, and they've got no labour law, they've got no environmental... You know, it would be such a big deal. They've got to replace it with something, and I think it's far more likely they might repeal one or two particularly irritating things, but they'll just sort of like leave it there and then bit by bit get to amending it in the way that they want. But it's a sort of myth that once they're out of Europe, suddenly everything's deregulated. And it's never been a really deregulated country anyway. I mean, in some ways it's less regulated than continental countries. But I mean, I remember people complained about red tape and health and safety regulation and over-regulation of labour when that was all indigenous law. There's this fantasy that you just leave and suddenly over-regulation comes when you have bureaucracies meet businesses, and bureaucracies generate rules, and businesses always think there's too many of them. And you know, you take your position on this, but it doesn't. I don't think it's really going to change very much, leaving the EU in that sense.
And if it would change, you would find out that regulation often serves a very useful purpose.
Indeed.
Like health.
I'm sure the tabloids will cover that extensively, that the regulations were so good. Timing. I think there's actually two things, and I'm not sure you seem to, so one is really about clarity in the relation between the EU and the UK, and I think that there the clock is ticking anyhow. So I mean, even if Cameron doesn't want to position himself right now and he's biding time, that will be very little time, and if it's more than 2 weeks, I would be surprised, but it may well be a couple of days, if not less. But the other bigger issue what I was referring to indeed, I think, is a collective European response and rethinking the European project. And sorry, but I don't see that happening. I mean, people have been saying, well, it's more than time that the European project is reconsidered for years. And we've only seen the reluctance to do that grow. And indeed, much depends on the voting cycles. And actually, we're pretty lucky in a way that next year, so often people look at the big three countries. Well, one is irrelevant by now, and the other two both have elections next year. So actually, you won't get a much better window than after 2017. So if ever, but I'm not too optimistic. But just looking at the windows that we have. Now, is politicization a good thing? Well, it's a dangerous thing. The thing is that you also have to be able to channel it. And I think the big risk is now that we debate a lot, we create a lot of havoc, talk a lot about options, but in the end, where do the voters get to express their views on the European Union? And there I think we haven't found a fix there. So let's consider the channel. So you have national elections. In national elections there's a lot at stake. And Europe is one of these things, and it's not necessarily the first thing on the list. Often it competes with more traditional socio-economic issues, for instance. And actually we know that on socio-economic issues most parties can position themselves, but then they're pretty internally divided on European issues. So national elections are not the best way. I mean, I'm sure European issues can get more attention in national elections than they do, but it's not the way that we're going to give expression to our feelings about it cannot carry the weight of being a channel in which feelings about European integration are expressed. So then we have European Parliament elections. Well, everyone is very warm about that, but not. And now, of course, we have Juncker and the Spitzenkandidat, and that will make it a much bigger event. But it's not really working so well yet. And for now, whatever we vote, we always get a centre-right Commission president. So I'm not sure that channel is not working too well either. And actually, then the third option is referendums. And we're not really ready for that in most countries. Maybe, Switzerland has a tradition. And actually, Ireland and Denmark seem to have, they have very mixed experiences, but at least there seems to be some comfort there. But for most of the other countries, referendums are one-offs. then you don't have them because you're so frustrated and traumatized that you try to postpone them for another 10 or 15 years. And then you have them again, and all the traumatization and frustration comes out again. And indeed, you're back where you are, and you rather postpone another 15, 20 years. So we're not building a habit there. But actually, I think we have to think much more. Probably we need referendums to vent feelings of European Union, but then we have to find much better ways to deal with them than we've done so far.
Okay, we're nearly out of time, but I'm going to take one more round of questions. There's I don't think I'll be able to take everybody. I'll take this gentleman here who's been waiting patiently. Then I'll take Frank van den Broeke, and maybe we take one more.
Okay, thanks. It's just really to follow up just on what you were saying, and also some of the stuff that Gareth was on about earlier. I saw a tweet today by Google Trends, which said the second highest search term from the UK today, after the results, was "what is the EU?" That was from Google Trends. I did not make that up. You can go and check. It's
Was it today or yesterday?
It's still there.
Maybe
that
that's
is
the other 28%.
We can laugh, but we can also be very frightened by that. And when you talk about, you mentioned that you think Spain knows, for instance, better what they're voting about when it comes to this kind of thing, that the public may be better aware, for instance. I do think, having grown up in the UK, whenever there was a news bulletin on, when the EU introduced, or EC in its former time, when it introduced something which was slightly painful, then it was always the EU has imposed this. But when we got something good, it was the UK government has introduced legislator to do X, Y, and Z. And it was a very, what do you think the role today is of the media, and especially new media kind of thing, which I realise Gareth may not be answer that because he's not too familiar with Twitter, he said.
So Frank van den Broeke over here.
Can I take it myself? It's easier, thank you. I'd like to reconnect with one of the opening statements by Gareth, who said, I think rightly, that the campaign was really a campaign that was trading in lies. You could say it was trading in illusions. Cameron, from the outset, the illusion that he could renegotiate a position for the UK that would be significantly different. Obviously, that's impossible because the UK already had so many exceptions. And then the Leave people trading in the illusion that they would regain sovereignty. And I think the morale of the story, first of all, is a politics that is trading in illusions ends in chaos and even more frustration. But should we not apply that to our own discourses today and the next few days and weeks? If we say, we will rethink the EU, strip it down, give more sovereignty to the peoples, is there an operational plan for that? I don't believe in that. I don't believe in that. And one of the reasons why I don't believe it is that taking the UK away, the Eurozone problematic is even more important. Now, the Eurozone problematic needs some further fixes. And these further fixes need a kind of political backing. You don't need a fully fledged political union, but for banking union, for capital market integration and other fixes which you need, you have to take further steps, give in more sovereignty. Should we not try to explain that to the people instead of now saying, we understood the message, we'll give back some sovereignty and strip down the EU? Or at least we should not say that if we cannot make it operational.
Okay, now, we'll take this gentleman here. We'll take, there are too many, but this gentleman here.
I would like to ask how a Brexit would affect the British role in other international organizations, for example, not only the WTO, but NATO or the United Nations or any other organization. And
Stop, but could we take the last two questions?
No, that was it. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll give it back to the panel, whoever wants to come in.
There's an easy answer on this question, because I think it's only WTO where the EU negotiates, but NATO, Britain is sort of as a single country member, the World Bank, the IMF, the EU has never succeeded in getting a seat. It's always individual countries that may represent other countries, but the UK is there individually, United Nations, and so on. It's only WTO where the EU has done the running.
The European Union has
No. None of these organizations is the EU vote. That doesn't mean there is sort of talk and the EU is invited and the Commission, the President of the Commission is all over the place. But the actual seat, for example, the Executive Board of the World Bank or the IMF is the UK, not the EU.
Gareth, you want to react to what Frank
I'd like
said?
to. I mean, I agree with everything you said. Mostly, that's the position. It's really the WTO and maybe a few others. We, I did think during this campaign, we really are paying the price. If for years and years you tell your population all bad stuff is the fault of the EU, eventually they believe you. And I thought one of Cameron's best arguments in this campaign, one of the most honest and effective arguments, might be to say to his population, all these things you're unhappy about, they're our fault. They're not the EU's fault. We did that to you, actually. But that's a difficult argument for a politician to make. But it's the truth. But he didn't, he chose, if you like, party over country. And he didn't make that argument, even though that's the truth. And so he went along with, it's the EU. And that's what you get. But you see, can we strip it down? I mean, I'm sort of mixed. I think we could strip it down a bit. But I mean, it's very cheap and easy to say, free trade. There's a big debate about how much it can be stripped down and whether it should be or whether we need political integration. But what I think is really, really important here is you have to take account. People often vote for laws on crime. They vote for a hard approach to crime, even though research shows it doesn't make you safer. But, they choose it. That's democracy. They often do things that don't work. It's possible to shrink the EU. It's possible to grow it. Now, there's a lot to be said. I think politicians should go out there and persuade. And if they think that the right answer is to integrate it and to move forward together and in greater depth, they should really try and persuade the people. And if people want to do that, great, go for it. But ultimately, you have to accept the choice of the people, and you have to make it possible for the people to express that choice. And the real danger of the EU is a sort of sense of like, no, the people cannot be listened to on this because it's just not the right approach. We have to keep going further. We have to keep further. That's the way to civil war.
I have a comment on this, and you're stripping down. I think the discussion of stripping down the EU reflects a misunderstanding that you also often see when people discuss deregulation. I've seen a lot of these debates when I lived in the US, and people who think that deregulation means abolishing rules don't understand the process, because the rules will just be back. Ronald Reagan, I think, abolished a large number of rules, and 5 years later the Federal Registry, which is sort of one measure of rules, was even thicker than before he started. If you really want to deregulate, you need to change the process through which you make rules, not abolish rules. It's the same with the EU. You can try to strip down individual measures that won't change anything, because there's a reason why these measures are taken. If the reason doesn't go away and the mechanism of making the rules doesn't go away, they'll just come back. It's more complicated. And I think, of course, you're right that we need to accept the choice of the people. That's sort of the whole idea of democracy. That suggests that if you want to explain this, well, you need to start making an effort doing that. And that's what politicians haven't done. I think that is real. It's the bankruptcy of the pro-Europe politicians that explains this outcome.
Okay, I saw two unsatisfied hands, and I'm going to take them. So there was this person, okay, but yeah, the problem is that like mushrooms, you're springing up.
That's nice.
I was challenged by the remark of Mr. Davies about being pragmatic and being creative. I wonder, is it necessary maybe in the short term to have a provisional arrangement with Britain, in the sense that we go back 50 years in history, like the French policy of the empty chair. But then Britain would offer itself, we offer the empty chair, we don't participate anymore in the European Council, in the Council of Ministers, we withdraw from the European Commission, so that's all fine. The European Union declares the same thing, we will not regard the United Kingdom part of the European project anymore, and then we will start making negotiations. The advantage is that there is no problem of timing, there is no reason for a rush. You can take 1 year, 5 years, even 20 years from now, and when there's a new agreement, you can put it again in a referendum, not only in Britain, but also in the Netherlands, in Denmark, in France, any country, so that you really find a new arrangement between the United Kingdom and the European Union. And also the advantage is, for the time being, the internal market will stay in place. And that is also a thing that everybody was concerned about. That was the economic argument. That was that we didn't want to make the people afraid of what might come. So in the short term, then nothing would be changed. So the markets would be calm again, and the people would have the feeling that Britain has really got rid of Europe.
Okay, the guy in front, who again was waiting patiently.
What if the problem is also within economics itself, in the way that we, the dominant paradigm on a spiritual level is that we have to compete with each other in order to find some kind of a meaning in life. And that creates a disbalance in not only in the individual, but in societies as well. And you see that reflected even in, the people are claiming some kind of humanity by thinking about them, searching for an identity. And if you think in a paradigm of free markets, you are erasing a very important social part of our societies. We are not seeing the value of compassion, for instance, in economics, and we value economics very, very much in our society. And I believe that's a misconception of what it is to be a real human being.
Okay, thank you. And since there was this one last question there, sorry, Dimitris, I think the statute of limitations is running. That's it.
Obviously a very sad day today, and thank you for all of your comments. So the UK Independence Party has pretty much won. They've got their independence. What do you see for the future of their party? And has Farage pretty much talked himself out of a job, seeing that they have no power in Parliament and he's an MEP? Would that mean that he would stop being an MEP? I don't know.
Okay, I throw it open to the panelists. Ben, maybe you want to start?
Okay. So how about poor Nigel? Let's start there. Well, for the time being, he's still safe in his MEP position for at least another 2 years, as it looks now. He will get his salary there. But I mean, of course, this whole outcome, I think it does boomerang back also on electoral politics and the electoral system of the UK. And it does boomerang back very severely on the state of the mainstream parties. So, I mean, I find it very difficult to predict. UKIP doesn't strike me as a very stable, coherent party. And if they would gain in success, I think that might well create internal turmoil. But I think that's very difficult to predict. And of course, the UK doesn't have a habit to call early elections, but I would almost suggest, well, think about it. No, but no, this is really very difficult to predict. I think in the end, I think for now, UKIP has been strengthened. And we can only think about scenarios where that will reverse. Let me just pick up a couple of comments from this round and also from the previous one. The empty chair solution is, of course, let's start thinking creatively. In a way, of course, the EEA, joining the European Economic Area, is in a way an empty chair. I mean, Norway is always an empty chair in a way. And it becomes even more interesting if you think of that the UK is scheduled, I think, to hold the presidency within less than 2 years, in the autumn of 2017. But then I have to think about the Belgian formation of 3 years ago or so. Without having somebody in the chair, sometimes things can slow down and actually work better than when you have an active chair. No, just on the international organizations, of course, I mean, it will be interesting whether dynamics within NATO will change. I mean, it does make a difference, I think, that the UK will leave the European Union. And I think the one other example what I was thinking was climate negotiations. So the European Union always plays a very loyal part, and indeed does most of the collective negotiation within the climate panel collectively. But now the UK can opt out from any European obligations and play its own game. So that may still create some interesting dynamics. Then finally on the media, and of course it's a double message. It's partly the age of new media, but in the end, of course, it goes down of the senders and politicians who send. And I think we see some changes. It's interesting how Sweder van Wijnbergen referred both to Timmermans and Dijsselbloem, I think, who try to play a new game in how they communicate about Europe, more realistically, but also more straightforward, and also owning up to the more negative burdens there. I think a lot, but there is a new trick to be learned by politicians in really owning up to interdependence, and taking into account that compromises have to be made and standing for them rather than blaming them on the others. And the media landscape, of course, does change. But in the end, of course, there's a lot of entertainment. I actually am rather optimistic that people can distinguish bullshit from information. And actually, in that sense, the fact that people are Googling what is the EU shows that in the end they're looking for information. It may be a bit too late, but at least in that sense, they're looking. They want to be informed. So, and there, I think it's still. I mean, the fact that 48% vote Remain in Britain, I think, also says something. And that wasn't self-evident that so many people in the EU. So, there, I think, if politicians become a bit more sophisticated in communicating complex messages of interdependence, and if we then we may find a way to deal with it. But we're still in a learning curve. No one is really knows how to handle this.
Sweder, final words?
Well, one sort of let me stray a little bit outside my area of expertise, and that's the empty chair suggestion that you made sounds very appealing. Look, we both sort of take a step back, and in the meantime, we reach a reasonable solution, sort of in the background, outside the limelight. Now, quite apart from the fact that doing this stuff outside the limelight is what I think got us into trouble to begin with, it also ignores another point, and that is that the vast majority of European-level decisions are in fact operative because they're embedded in national law. It's not the European Commission that actually maintains this, but it's your own legal structure, and it's your own legislative bodies that does this. And so stepping back from everything we've decided would mean, like Gareth was saying, sort of basically stepping back from half of what you have on the books is laws, and what do you do without them? Now, there was this long story about needing a new paradigm. I don't know whether that's the case, but certainly I think I agree that, and I think I've said that today, that we have ignored way too often the social cost of reforms that seemed sort of much smaller in our view than the long-term benefits, but you forget that this is done on an individual basis. If you lose your job because of whatever measure that may be very good for the country in the long run, well, that doesn't do you much good if you in the meantime lose your job. So I think it's certainly true that we should pay much more attention to the social cost of these reform measures and try to be more creative in devising transitional strategies that help the people who are the losers of this whole process without derailing the reforms that trigger that to begin with. But that may well be sort of a difficult thing to do, particularly if it's true what most economists think, is that the increasing inequality is not due to anything in our system or paradigm or whatever, but simply to a skill premium. The economy is moving in directions that pay a very high premium for two people who have a particular skill. And if you are part of how many people who are halfway their 50s and have in fact not all that much education can be retrained, so they capture some of that. My suspicion is that's an almost impossible challenge, and that's the real challenge. Not the new paradigm, but this very real conflict that we as more traditional economists also see.
So, Gareth, you have the last word.
Thank you very much. I mean, on the empty chair thing, I agree entirely. It's the kind of thing the relationship therapist would suggest in this sort of situation. And I think you're absolutely right, and I can't put it better than you said it is. I'd really like to see something like this happen. It would be a constructive way forward. On the presidency, I gather that the current position of the Brexiteers is, well, we'll still be in then, and so we'll still do the presidency, which is going to be fun to see. I mean, whatever else you say about this, it's interesting. And on the, I can't really comment on economics, but I do think actually, and I've been thinking this for a while. The British vote, the British position, is to some extent part of a wider disaffection with Europe. And the wider disaffection with Europe, though, is part of the wider disaffection in rich societies. And it's not actually just the underclass. There is a sort, I think, a poor little rich kid situation, which is generally in rich societies. We've reached a really remarkable and unprecedented degree of material wealth and actually security, and yet somehow we have a sense that we haven't quite worked out how to make our lives good. And we are maybe that's technology or global, whatever it is, but I'm not the person to do it. But historians looking back on this, I'm sure, will very much place this in a bigger context of trying to work out how to live after you're rich.
Okay. On that note, I think it just remains to thank the panelists, first of all, for their courage in being willing to gaze into the unknown, and secondly, for their insights in so doing.